Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that is both heartbreaking and infuriating about King Henry VIII and Bessie Blount, the woman who gave the king what the entire Tudor court desired most, a son. But soon after, she was cast aside, erased from royal memory as if she had never existed. This isn't just a story about love, it's a brutal reminder of the price women paid in a world where the power of men decided everything. A young, beautiful, intelligent girl drawn into the whirlwind of ambition, desire, and oblivion. And in the end, what chills us most is not how she was abandoned, but how history itself deliberately erased her name from its pages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching this right now, leave a comment telling me where you're from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who's listening with me in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Bessie Blount was born in the rural county of Shropshire, England, toward the end of the 15th century, into a small noble family belonging to the minor gentry. Her family possessed a modest title and some land, but not enough to live in luxury. A single lost lawsuit or one failed harvest could wipe out everything they owned. In post-Wars of the Roses England, as the social order was being reshaped, small noble families like the Blounts carried both the veneer of gentility and the constant fear of financial ruin. In that misty countryside of green hills and sheep pastures, the girl named Bessie grew up among the sounds of church bells and bleating flocks. She possessed a gentle beauty, yet carried within her a quiet yearning to rise above the fate assigned to her. But for a girl born into her class, the future allowed only three predetermined paths: marriage, the convent, or service as a lady-in-waiting. The first option, marriage, meant becoming the wife of an older gentleman, bearing children, and spending a silent life behind manor gates, never speaking her own mind. The second, entering a convent, meant embracing a life of austerity, praying 6 times a day, kneeling on cold stone floors until her knees grew calloused, and dying in silence, forgotten by the world. The third, serving at court, was both dangerous and glittering with promise, a place where beauty, wit, and grace could lift a woman above her station in a society obsessed with power and reputation. The Blount family, aware of their limitations, placed all their hopes on this third path. They taught their daughter how to curtsy, speak softly and politely, dance with elegance, and hide her true feelings behind a smile. At about 14 or perhaps 15 years old, Bessie was sent to court to serve as a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of King Henry VIII. The duties of a maid of honour seemed simple: stand behind the Queen, help her dress, prepare her jewels, offer handkerchiefs, and smile at the proper moments during ceremonies. But beneath the splendour of the Tudor palace lay an oppressive world, where young girls were taught to look like angels while enduring the gaze of predatory eyes. The Tudor court, with its music, masquerades, and intoxicating wine, was in truth a hunt disguised as ritual. Under the flicker of candlelight during grand feasts, Bessie learned to move lightly as air, to sing just enough to charm the room, and to smile as if no fear lived in her heart. Yet in that dazzling place filled with traps, a young girl like her was little more than prey in a garden of power. Among the many watchful eyes, one lingered on her Prince Henry. At that time, Henry was not yet the bloated, suspicious tyrant that history remembers. He was the perfect Renaissance prince, over 6 feet tall, with reddish, gold hair, broad shoulders, skilled at riding, archery, jousting, and dancing. He could sing, compose music, play the lute, write poetry, and speak fluent French, Spanish, and Latin. A young man of learning and charisma and of boundless pride. Yet behind his golden aura loomed the greatest fear of the entire Tudor dynasty. There was no male heir. Catherine of Aragon had been pregnant many times, at least 6, but only one child survived, the Princess Mary. Every son had died either before or shortly after birth. In a nation that had only recently escaped civil war, the absence of a male successor was a looming catastrophe. Henry believed the Tudor line would collapse without a son, and, like most men of his time, he blamed his wife. To ease that fear, Henry turned to other women, partly to satisfy desire, but also to prove to the world that the fault was not his. And Bessie, with her gentle beauty, her gift for song and dance, and her graceful conduct amid the scheming world of court, soon caught the eye of the young monarch-to-be. During mist-veiled banquets where music mingled with the clinking of goblets, Henry's gaze rested on the girl from Shropshire, innocent yet captivating. In every dance, she moved modestly, yet her eyes spoke in ways her lips dared not. And it took only one moment, a glance held longer than court etiquette allowed, for her life to shift forever. The golden light of the palace, once a promise of glory, would soon become a radiant trap. Bessie Blount, that 15-year-old country girl, had no idea she was walking toward a tragedy, one that would bury her name in the shadows of history for 500 years. Life at the Tudor court was a blend of suffocating ceremony and unpredictable danger. As a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Bessie Blount lived beneath the constant weight of courtly expectation. She was forbidden to speak loudly, never to laugh too freely, and required to lower her gaze whenever she passed a nobleman. Every movement, every breath, was part of a performance. The grand banquets that dazzled visitors with their silk gowns and golden embroidery were little more than a mask, a glittering facade concealing whispers in the shadows, quiet bargains between families, and the endless struggle for position. When night fell, the court transformed. Behind closed doors and candlelit corridors, the palace became a hunting ground, where powerless young women were pursued by powerful men. Beauty was no longer a gift, it was a currency. For the daughters of the minor gentry, their faces, voices, and bodies could buy their families land, favour, or access to royal circles, but only if they pleased the right man. Bessie's father, Sir John Blount, understood this cruel arithmetic all too well. He was a minor nobleman, loyal to the crown, but always walking a fine line between survival and ruin. The Blounts knew how the game was played, that a well-placed daughter could secure advantages no army or lawsuit could. And so, Bessie was trained not merely to serve but to charm. She was taught how to dance with grace that seemed effortless, how to speak softly so that men would lean closer to hear, and how to maintain an expression serene enough to hide ambition. In that glittering world, one glance could change everything. A brief meeting of eyes across the dance floor, one word spoken too sweetly, one movement too graceful, and the machinery of fate began to turn. When the prince's attention fell upon a girl, it was never a question of if, but when she would be summoned. And for her family, such notice meant opportunity. New titles, lucrative posts, marriage alliances, pensions, and land grants. It was the only ladder a minor gentry family could climb, a ladder built from the reputations of their daughters. At the age of 15 or 16, Bessie began to see how fragile her place was within that golden cage. The silk curtains, the music, the laughter, all of it served to conceal a system that consumed women's youth and silence. She learned quickly that secrets were a form of armor. To survive, one had to master stillness, to conceal fear behind composure. Even her tears, when they came, had to be invisible. Meanwhile, Prince Henry, the embodiment of Renaissance vigour, lived for spectacle. He was tall, striking, and restless, a man who loved music, tournaments, and the sound of applause. He excelled at hunting, jousting, and debating theology with scholars, but behind the celebration of his talents lay an ache that haunted every Tudor banquet and prayer: the absence of a male heir. Queen Catherine had endured at least 6 pregnancies, yet only one child, Princess Mary, had survived. Each miscarriage, each tiny coffin, deepened the fear that God had cursed their union. The court whispered. Ambassadors reported rumours. Nobles began to question whether the Tudor line, founded only a generation earlier in the year 1485, would endure. England's memory of the Wars of the Roses, the decades of bloodshed that had ended only with Henry VII's victory, was still fresh. The idea of returning to civil war terrified everyone, and in the superstitious logic of the 16th century, blame always fell upon the woman. Catherine's failure to produce a son was treated not as a tragedy but as a personal flaw, a divine punishment, or proof of physical weakness. Henry's pride could not bear the humiliation. Publicly, he remained the dutiful husband. Privately, he began to seek solace elsewhere. Pilgrimages and prayers gave way to secrecy and indulgence. Mistresses were whispered about behind tapestries and guarded doors. And somewhere amid the music and laughter, Bessie Blount became one of them. One of the women drawn into the orbit of royal power, where affection and danger were indistinguishable. For Bessie, it was a role without safety. By day, she served the Queen, dressing her, attending her, kneeling beside her during Mass. By night, she might be sent for in silence, her footsteps muffled on the stone floors as she was led toward the King's private chambers. To refuse would be unthinkable, even treasonous. Consent in such a world was an illusion wrapped in velvet. To outsiders, being chosen by the King might seem an honor, the highest form of favor. But to the women who lived it, it was a chain. A mistress could never acknowledge her position openly. She was simultaneously envied and despised. Her reputation was marked the instant she entered the royal bed. Most noblemen would never marry a woman the King had touched. And when the King's attention drifted, as it always did, she would be quietly married off to someone respectable, sent away with gifts and erased. Bessie understood this truth, even as she was caught within it. Every glance from Henry felt like a mixture of danger and destiny. His charm, his brilliance, the warmth in his voice, all of it concealed the power to destroy her. In the candlelight of banquets and the dim corridors of Whitehall, she was learning how desire and fear could coexist. Around her, the court continued its performance. Ladies in gold-threaded gowns danced as lutes played. Courtiers laughed and gossiped, trading alliances as easily as glances. Beneath the music, however, there pulsed a constant anxiety. The knowledge that one man's longing for a son could determine the fate of a nation and the lives of every woman who entered his path. To be near Henry VIII was to stand beside the sun, radiant, irresistible, and deadly to those who lingered too long. And Bessie, the girl from Shropshire, had already stepped into the light. Not long after she drew the prince's gaze, Bessie Blount became his secret mistress. As a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon, she had to maintain the most delicate balance, imaginable, cheerful, and obedient by day, silent and invisible by night. During the sunlight hours, she dressed the Queen, helped her into prayer robes, smiled demurely, and curtsied with practiced grace. But when darkness settled over the palace, she slipped quietly through the private corridors of the royal apartments, where Prince Henry waited behind locked doors. Bessie had learned when to speak and when to keep her silence, when to lower her eyes, and when to offer a fleeting smile that reassured without overstepping. Her brilliance was subtle. She never demanded, never flaunted her closeness to the prince, and never allowed a whisper of scandal to escape her shadow. In the rigid silence of the Tudor court, she perfected an art that few could master, hiding in plain sight, while being the only one the King truly saw. Their relationship began around the year 1517 or perhaps 1518, when Bessie was about 16 or 17 years old, and Henry around 22 or 23. By modern standards, it was a grave abuse of power, a royal man taking possession of a teenage girl who had no choice but to obey. Yet in the moral code of 16th century England, 16 was considered of age, fully fit for marriage, and for submission. In the dim light of history, Bessie's silence was not complicity, it was survival. Henry, restless and ambitious, had long grown frustrated with his marriage to Catherine. She had given him one living daughter, Mary, but no sons. The Tudor dynasty's fragile legitimacy depended on producing a male heir. For Henry, every failed pregnancy was both a humiliation and a threat to his throne. And so, the young prince turned to Bessie not out of love, but from a desperate need to prove himself capable of fathering a son. To him, she became a vessel for reassurance, a symbol that his body, not his destiny, was sound. Bessie understood this with devastating clarity. She was not naive. In every whispered word, in every touch, she could sense that she was being used to soothe a royal insecurity. Yet refusal was impossible. In the Tudor world, to deny the king's will was treason not only for her, but for her family. A woman who resisted royal command risked not scandal but annihilation. Confiscated lands, imprisonment in the Tower, or even execution under vague charges of betrayal. No one refused a Tudor king and lived unscathed. So, she adapted. She survived by accepting the rhythm of two lives, visible service and hidden submission. By day, she embodied serenity and devotion. By night, she surrendered her body while guarding her soul. She never wept in public, never demanded promises, never asked questions. In this, She was wiser than many who came after her. Other ladies of the court had been ruined by envy, banished for gossip, or driven to despair by royal neglect. Bessie's genius was endurance, the quiet art of appearing untouched while bearing unbearable truths. Weeks passed into months, and beneath her silken gowns, anxiety began to stir. Her body betrayed her first fatigue, faintness, the absence of her monthly bleeding. She waited, hoping it was nothing. There were no midwives to trust, no tests to confirm what instinct already knew. Each morning brought a new wave of fear and nausea. Alone in her chamber, Bessie must have whispered the same question to herself. Am I blessed, or am I doomed? When she finally accepted the truth that she was carrying Henry's child, her world contracted into a single, inescapable fate. Pregnancy, for a royal mistress, was both privilege and peril. If she bore a healthy boy, her family might rise. If she miscarried or birthed a girl, she might be discarded and forgotten. And through it all, she knew the risk of death in childbirth hovered near every woman's bed. By royal decree, her condition was concealed. To protect the king's reputation and the queen's dignity, Bessie was quietly sent away from court, her absence explained as an illness. Historical whispers suggest she was moved to a royal manor in the countryside, perhaps one belonging to the Blount family in Shropshire, or to a small convent-like estate near London. Her parents were forbidden to accompany her. Only a few loyal servants were chosen to attend, each sworn to secrecy under threat of punishment. In the dim, draughty chambers of her enforced exile, Bessie lived in isolation. She could not walk in the gardens or attend mass openly. Each visitor was screened, every letter censored. The walls that once echoed with music were replaced by the steady pulse of fear. She was no longer a courtly ornament, but a political liability wrapped in flesh. Her body was now a royal matter, her womb a potential answer to England's crisis of succession. As the months advanced, Bessie's thoughts must have turned in restless circles. Fear of dying in childbirth, fear of losing the king's favour, fear of the future. Each flutter in her belly was both a promise and a warning. She prayed, perhaps, that the child would be a boy, that Henry would keep his word to protect her family. Yet she must also have known that, once her purpose was fulfilled, her presence would no longer be necessary. In the quiet of that confinement, she existed in a strange limbo between power and disappearance. The king's messengers came and went, bringing medical supplies, fine linens, or tokens of comfort, but never company. The air smelled of wax and herbs. Outside her window, autumn turned to winter, and the world forgot her. For Bessie Blount, this was the cruel paradox of royal intimacy. To be chosen was to be silenced. To be valued was to be hidden. She was the most visible woman in England for one man, and utterly invisible to everyone else. Each night, she lay awake, listening to her heartbeat echo through the stillness, knowing that within her grew not just a child, but the measure of her fate. The pregnancy that had once seemed like quiet confinement soon turned into a confrontation with death itself. In Tudor England, childbirth was a perilous gamble. Nearly 1 in 3 women faced the risk of dying during labour or from its aftermath. There were no hospitals, no sterile instruments, no understanding of bacteria, no anesthesia, no antibiotics. Medicine was a matter of superstition, herbs and faith. For Bessie Blount, barely 17 years old, the approach of childbirth meant entering a world of agony from which many never returned. The day arrived without ceremony. Gone were the silks, the jewels, the soft laughter of courtly music. She was moved into a birthing chamber, a small, sealed room with the windows shuttered and curtains drawn to block the chill. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of burning herbs, candle wax, and the metallic tang of blood. Only women were allowed inside. The midwives, a handful of female attendants, and perhaps 1 or 2 servants from her household. No man, not even the king, would ever enter that room. In place of medicine, she was offered superstition. A Bible might have been laid open on the pillow near her head. A ribbon from the king's doublet might have been tied around her wrist for good fortune. Someone might have whispered that drinking half a cup of strong wine could dull the pain, though it would more likely leave her dizzy and disoriented. Then came the pain raw, relentless, beyond words. The contractions began as waves, building in rhythm, then breaking into agony. They could last for 12, 15, even 24 hours. There was no morphine, no relief but prayer. Each spasm was like a blade twisting deep within her. The midwives whispered encouragements, their voices trembling. Somewhere outside, a servant might have been praying, or pacing, or holding a handkerchief to his mouth to muffle the sound of her screams. In that long, fevered night, Bessie Blount ceased to be a courtly ornament and became only a body struggling for survival. Her skin burned with sweat, her breath came in gasps, and her strength faded with each passing hour. The tearing of the flesh, the perineal wound that every Tudor woman feared, was almost inevitable. When the baby's head began to crown, the pressure was unbearable. For a heartbeat, she thought her ribs would burst, that her lungs would fail. And then a cry. A sharp, miraculous sound cutting through the thick air. A baby's cry. The room froze. The midwives exchanged glances. Someone began to sob quietly in relief. Against all odds, both mother and child had survived. For one fragile moment, Bessie felt the stillness that comes not from joy, but from sheer disbelief, the quiet that follows surviving something that should have killed you. She was alive. Her child was alive. That was enough. But the ordeal was not over. In Tudor England, the real danger came after birth. The placenta had to be delivered, and if even a small fragment remained inside, infection could set in. The midwives worked quickly, using strips of cloth and herbal salves in place of sterile tools. There was no anesthesia, as they stitched the torn flesh with rough thread, no antiseptic to cleanse the wound. The pain returned, sharp and unending. The risk of puerperal fever blood poisoning from infection hung over her like a shadow. Many women, strong and healthy before childbirth, died within days. Their bodies trembled uncontrollably, their skin turned cold and clammy, and their eyes dimmed as fever consumed them. The Tudor physicians could do nothing but bleed them further, pray, and watch them fade. But Bessie Blount did not die. She endured. Her youth, perhaps her constitution, saved her. When she finally regained consciousness, the midwife placed a small, warm bundle beside her. It was a boy, Henry Fitzroy, his name meaning Henry, son of the king. The infant was healthy, strong, and allowed everything the king had prayed for. His birth was both a private miracle and a public triumph. It proved what Henry VIII had long insisted, that his body was capable, that God had not cursed him with sterility. The unspoken implication was clear: if he could father a healthy son with Bessie Blount, then the fault for England's lack of heirs lay not with him, but with Queen Catherine. For Bessie, this truth was as devastating as it was powerful. Her son's cry had not only saved her life, it had sealed her fate. The very moment she succeeded in bringing forth the king's longed-for son, she ceased to be necessary. Her body had served its purpose. Her usefulness was spent. Within weeks, the machinery of royal discretion moved into motion. Orders were issued quietly, signatures written in the king's sharp hand. The infant was removed from her care and sent to be raised among trusted courtiers under royal supervision in secrecy, but with privilege. The king's illegitimate child would not be left in the hands of his mother. Bessie herself was not summoned back to court. Instead, arrangements were made the same solution used for many royal mistresses before her. She would be married off to a suitable nobleman, given a respectable title and estate, and thus removed from the delicate orbit of scandal. It was a strategy designed to cleanse the court's conscience and protect the king's image. Before her departure, she may have been permitted to hold her child one last time. Perhaps she memorized the curve of his tiny fingers, the rhythm of his breathing. Perhaps she whispered a prayer into his ear, asking the saints to guard him where she could not. Then he was taken away wrapped in linen, carried by a nurse into a carriage bound for a royal household far from hers. The palace that had once glittered before her now seemed distant, like a dream slipping into fog. She had given the king what he wanted: a son, a symbol, proof of divine favor. And in doing so, she had erased herself from his world. In the quiet that followed, Bessie Blount became invisible once more. She was no longer a mistress, not yet a wife, merely a woman who had survived what should have killed her, and lost what she could never reclaim. The birth of Henry Fitzroy had changed the course of English history, and quietly, irreversibly, destroyed the life of the woman who bore him. Immediately after giving birth to the king's son, Bessie Blount was removed from London and placed in seclusion, perhaps at a small, walled convent in Essex, or within a secluded manor granted for her recovery. The location was chosen for silence, not comfort. Only a handful of trusted attendants were permitted to care for her, sworn to secrecy under penalty of royal punishment. Her world, once filled with the glitter and gossip of the Tudor court, shrank to a few dimly lit rooms where no one spoke her name aloud. Her child, however, Henry Fitzroy, was raised in splendor. The boy was officially recognized by his father and granted a title unprecedented for an illegitimate child of the English crown. In the year 1525, at not yet 6 years old, he was named Duke of Richmond and Somerset, with the formal style, the right high and mighty prince, Henry Fitzroy. His status placed him above nearly all nobles in England, second only to legitimate heirs who did not yet exist. Fitzroy's upbringing was designed to mirror that of a true prince. He was given estates, a large annual income, his own royal household, tutors in Latin and Greek, masters of fencing and horsemanship, and a court of young attendants who bowed to him as though he were a future king. The boy was adored by courtiers and groomed for destiny. Later, he would be betrothed to Mary Howard, daughter of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, a political match that tied him firmly to one of the realm's most influential families. From afar, Bessie must have heard whispers of these honours. Each new announcement was a reminder that her son, the child she had nearly died bringing into the world, was alive and thriving yet entirely beyond her reach. The joy of his survival was inseparable from the grief of her erasure. She was not permitted letters, not granted visits, not even acknowledged as his mother in official records. To speak her name near his was to risk the king's displeasure. To ensure her silence and stability, the crown arranged a suitable marriage for her. She was wed to Gilbert Taleboys, a Lincolnshire gentleman of modest rank but impeccable loyalty to the Tudor court. For the Blount family, the marriage secured honour. For the king, it ensured that his former mistress disappeared respectably from the political stage. Taleboys was neither cruel nor particularly affectionate, merely dutiful. Bessie moved north to his estates, far from the court's candlelit intrigue, and adapted to a life that appeared peaceful from the outside. She managed the household, oversaw servants, and gave birth to 3 children. Yet beneath that domestic calm lived a quiet ache that never faded. Every time she looked upon her younger sons, she must have imagined the child she could not raise, the boy whose existence had both elevated and exiled her. In the year 1530, Gilbert Taleboys died, leaving Bessie a widow before she reached her mid-30s. Once again, her future was not hers to decide. Before the year ended, arrangements were made for her remarriage, this time to Edward Clinton, a rising nobleman destined to become one of England's most prominent figures. Clinton would later serve as Lord High Admiral under King Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, by Jane Seymour. The marriage was practical, perhaps even protective, ensuring that Bessie remained within circles loyal to the crown and safely distant from scandal. Whether Bessie had any affection for Clinton is unknown. History records no letters, no poems, no trace of her voice. She played her part quietly, a second wife managing estates and attending to household duties, her name mentioned only in legal documents and property records. The brilliance that once drew the king's attention was now hidden behind veils of duty and silence. As years passed, Bessie's life settled into a pattern of routine morning prayers, household accounts, seasonal festivals, and endless correspondence about land and tenants. From time to time, travellers from court would bring tidings of her son, the Duke of Richmond. They spoke of his intelligence, his skill with the sword, his good health, and his resemblance to the king. Each word must have pierced her heart with equal measures of pride and pain. Yet Bessie also heard the darker news that even the Duke of Richmond, for all his privilege, lived beneath the same shadow of uncertainty that had defined her own existence. Though he bore a royal title, his birth outside wedlock barred him from full legitimacy. Some at court whispered that Henry might one day name him heir. Others dismissed him as a political pawn. Bessie's private grief deepened in the summer of 1536 when Henry Fitzroy, only 17 years old, died suddenly, likely from tuberculosis. She never saw him again. By then, she had already been silenced for over a decade, and news of his death would have reached her only through rumour or letter read aloud by another. Her son, the living proof of the king's virility, was gone. and with him vanished the last trace of her connection to the royal world. Bessie Blount herself would not live much longer. She is believed to have died around the year 1540, in her early 40s, perhaps at one of the Clinton estates in Lincolnshire. No tomb was erected, no inscription marked her resting place. Her name appears only in scattered records, a mention in property rolls, a note in genealogies, a whisper in royal correspondence. Her story, pieced together from fragments, is one of beauty consumed by power and silence enforced by survival. Bessie Blount gave the Tudor dynasty what it desired most, a son, and in return, she was erased from its memory. If the history books celebrate kings and queens, she remains among the countless women whose bodies built the foundation of those reigns unseen, unthanked, and unnamed. To remember Bessie is to acknowledge the truth behind the glittering facade of Tudor splendor, that every triumph of the throne was paid for in the quiet suffering of women who were never meant to be remembered. After her arranged marriage to Gilbert Talboys, Bessie Blount left the royal court behind and travelled north to Lincolnshire, a land of fertile soil and icy winds. It was a place far removed from London's splendour, its great halls, and the hum of gossip that once surrounded her name. Gilbert was a local nobleman, not distinguished in politics or lineage, but respectable enough to shield the Blount family from the lingering scandal of her past. For Bessie, the match was less a choice than a verdict, security in exchange for silence. Her new life unfolded in the rhythm of the countryside. Days were marked by the toll of the church bell, by the sound of carts rattling down muddy lanes, by the endless tasks of running a noble household. She managed the estate, supervised harvests, settled disputes among tenants, and oversaw the accounts. She paid taxes, arranged marriages for servants, and kept the granaries stocked against famine. She bore 3 children with Gilbert, 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Anne, and 1 son, George. They became the centre of her visible world. She taught them manners, how to curtsy, how to write in a clear hand, and how to show humility before higher ranks. When she attended local feasts or church gatherings, she appeared as the model of a virtuous wife, well-dressed but modest, graceful but restrained. Yet beneath the calm exterior, a quiet grief endured. No day passed without the shadow of her first child, Henry Fitzroy, the son who had nearly taken her life, and yet had become the king's pride. The boy she had held for only moments was now a prince in all but name, living among tutors and courtiers, surrounded by wealth she could barely imagine. His annual income reached thousands of pounds, exceeding that of many European dukes. In the year 1525, when Fitzroy was formally created Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Bessie heard the news not from a messenger, but through local whispers. Later, when he was admitted into the Order of the Garter, a distinction reserved for the most exalted of the realm, her pride must have been mingled with piercing sorrow. Her son had achieved the recognition that once eluded her, yet she could not be there, not even as a distant observer. While Fitzroy grew into a symbol of Tudor strength, Bessie's name faded further from memory. At court, no one mentioned her. In official chronicles, she existed only as a faint reference, a certain gentlewoman of Shropshire. Her letters, if she ever sent them, went unanswered. To the world, the mother of the Duke of Richmond had ceased to exist. Then, in the year 1530, misfortune struck again. Gilbert Talboys died, leaving Bessie a widow at about 35 years old. Before she could even mourn him properly, another arrangement was made, another royal decision disguised as providence. She was married to Edward Clinton, a nobleman of rising importance. Clinton was ambitious and politically astute, a man who would later become Lord High Admiral of England under King Edward VI and eventually the Earl of Lincoln. Their marriage, though respectable, was less a union of affection than a continuation of the king's control over Bessie's fate. Henry VIII, ever cautious about loose tongues, ensured that his former mistress remained bound to the crown through loyalty and silence. Bessie moved once more this time to the eastern counties of England, far from the capital. The landscapes of Lincolnshire were replaced by the rolling fields of the coast, where the air smelled of salt and seaweed. Here, life was quieter still. She attended local masses, hosted dignified dinners, and presided over her household with calm authority. In the presence of guests, she was courteous but distant, her smiles brief, her eyes often lowered. But even there, gossip reached her. At noble gatherings, she overheard courtiers murmuring about the young Duke of Richmond, his education, his vigour, his favoured position in the king's heart. They said he spoke Latin with the ease of a scholar, rode with elegance, and had been promised to Lady Mary Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. They speculated that he might be legitimised, perhaps even named heir to the throne. Each rumour was a dagger wrapped in silk. For Bessie, the knowledge that her son lived so near to the throne, yet so far from her arms, was both comfort and torment. She could not write, could not travel, could not even speak of him in prayer without fear of trespassing on royal secrecy. The rules of Tudor propriety demanded that she forget him, though her body still carried the memory of his first cry. In the privacy of her chamber, she lived between two worlds. One was warm, the quiet domestic circle of her husband and younger children, where laughter was gentle and love was simple. The other was cold, the invisible world of royal power, where her name was erased and her motherhood forbidden. In that cold world, she was neither honoured nor condemned. She was simply omitted. As the years drifted by, Bessie's isolation deepened. Letters from London arrived bearing only political news. No one spoke of her child. She had survived childbirth, disgrace, and royal abandonment. Yet the one thing she could not survive was oblivion. She knew that her story would not be written in any chronicle, that even her son's triumphs would not restore her name. Night after night, in the quiet of the countryside, Bessie must have felt the strange ache of being both alive and forgotten. She had given England a prince and been rewarded with silence. Her existence had been absorbed into the machinery of power, a mother without title, a woman without a past. In the end, Lincolnshire became her cage, as much as her refuge, a place where she ruled her household with grace, yet carried within her the ghost of a son she would never again call her own. As Henry Fitzroy grew within the royal world, his mother lived far away, counting his milestones not through sight but through whispers. When Fitzroy turned 6 years old, the court erupted in ceremony. Trumpets sounded across London as the king's illegitimate son was granted the titles Duke of Richmond and Somerset. The choice of Richmond was no accident. It was the title Henry himself had borne before he ascended the throne in the year 1509. It carried a deep, symbolic weight, suggesting inheritance, legitimacy, and continuity of the royal line. To many observers, the act was shocking. The king was openly elevating a son born outside marriage, granting him the privileges reserved for princes of the blood. Courtiers whispered that Henry might secretly intend to make Fitzroy his heir a derivative prince, through whom the Tudor dynasty could be secured if Queen Catherine bore no living sons. The move was daring, even reckless. English law forbade illegitimate children from inheriting the crown unless Parliament formally legitimised them, and doing so would strip Princess Mary, Catherine's lawful daughter, of her claim. Thus, factions formed within the royal court. One side, loyal to Henry's pride and desperate to avoid civil unrest, supported legitimising Fitzroy. The other, led by conservative churchmen and scholars of canon law, opposed it vehemently. They feared that granting the throne to a son of sin would taint the monarchy and invite divine punishment. The debate simmered quietly, spreading through ambassadorial letters and private correspondence, but its consequences loomed like a storm over England's fragile peace. While London celebrated, Bessie Blount remained in silence. From her estate in Lincolnshire, she heard faint reports carried by riders and servants accounts of the grand ceremony at Westminster, the golden robes, the royal heralds proclaiming her son's new name. She was not invited. There were no letters from the king, no official acknowledgement of her role. In that moment of glory, she existed only as a shadow behind a closed door. She must have imagined the scene as she listened to the wind rattling the windows, the hall filled with music, the banners bearing the Tudor rose, the nobles kneeling as her son received the sword of investiture. Perhaps she whispered his name to herself, Henry Fitzroy, while tears slid quietly down her cheeks. To the world, he was the king's son. To her, he was still the child she had once held for a heartbeat in a chamber filled with blood and pain. Under royal supervision, Fitzroy's education flourished. His tutors included Richard Croke, a celebrated scholar of Greek who had once studied under Erasmus, and George Cotton, his trusted governor. The boy's days were filled with Latin recitations, mathematics, music, and philosophy. He rode daily, trained in swordsmanship, practiced the lute, and learned to dance with the elegance expected of a prince. His upbringing was modelled on that of the finest noble youth in Europe, a preparation not for obscurity, but for rule. Meanwhile, Bessie was allowed only fragments of information discreetly relayed by sympathetic courtiers or servants passing through the countryside. She would ask no questions aloud, only listen as someone described the colour of his hair, the way he laughed, or how the king seemed proud when the boy entered the hall. Those scraps of news became her lifeline, proof that he still lived, that he still remembered the world she had once belonged to. Yet as Fitzroy's star rose, the politics surrounding him grew darker. By the late 1520s, Queen Catherine was over 40 and unlikely to bear another child. The king's frustration deepened into obsession. He sought an annulment of his marriage, claiming that God had cursed his union because Catherine had once been his brother's wife. Around him, a new figure had begun to glitter: Anne Boleyn, young, ambitious, and unlike any woman the court had ever seen. For Bessie, this shift was both familiar and terrifying. She understood the pattern too well. How swiftly the king's attention could elevate a woman, and how cruelly it could destroy her. But she also knew what this meant for her son. If Anne Boleyn bore a legitimate male heir, Fitzroy's purpose would vanish. He would no longer be the king's plan B, no longer the hidden promise of continuity. His titles, his lands, even his life could be swept aside in a single breath of royal decree. From her estate, Bessie followed these developments with dread. She was nearly 40, experienced enough to read the signs of courtly danger. Each letter that arrived from London carried not only news but anxiety. The politics of the king's marriage dominated every conversation. Nobles chose sides, some supporting the Queen, others favouring Anne. The papal court in Rome became entangled. Ambassadors exchanged accusations, and all the while, England's stability hung on the question of who would bear the next son. And amid that chaos, Fitzroy's fate remained suspended. He was treated with extraordinary honour, invited to attend official functions, even to preside over councils in the king's absence. Yet those honours were fragile, dependent entirely on Henry's favour. To fall from grace could be as sudden as a shift in wind. Bessie endured this uncertainty in quiet dignity. She continued to fulfil her duties at the Clinton household, managing estates, attending to guests, organising harvest festivals. Her composure never faltered. To her servants and neighbours, she was a serene noblewoman, respected and restrained. But at night, when the house fell silent, she wept in solitude. The son for whom she had risked her life was now a man she could neither see nor speak to, and his destiny, like hers, rested on the whim of a king. She must have known that her presence would never again be requested at court, that no portrait of her would hang in the halls of Whitehall. No historian would record her words. Between the quiet fields of Lincolnshire and the glittering corridors of the palace stretched only absence, a distance not measured in miles but in silence. Each passing year deepened that silence, until it became her second skin. The world had divided her in two. One life lived openly as Lady Clinton, the other forever hidden in the shadow of a child who belonged to history, but never to her. By the late 1520s, Henry VIII had turned his full attention to Anne Boleyn, one of Queen Catherine's former ladies-in-waiting. His pursuit of her was relentless, calculated, and dangerous. Henry was no longer content to keep a mistress in secret. He wanted Anne as his wife and queen. But to do so, he needed to destroy the marriage that had bound him to Catherine for more than 20 years. He began by claiming that his union with Catherine was unlawful in the eyes of God because she had once been married to his elder brother, Prince Arthur, who had died in the year 1502. Henry insisted that their marriage violated biblical law, citing verses from Leviticus to justify his argument. Catherine, dignified and resolute, denied it, maintaining that her first marriage had never been consummated. When the Pope refused to grant an annulment, Henry broke with Rome altogether. In the year 1534, he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severing the centuries-old authority of the Vatican. What began as a personal obsession soon ignited the English Reformation, a revolution that would fracture religion, politics, and family loyalties for generations to come. In the midst of this upheaval, Anne Boleyn triumphed. She was crowned Queen of England in the year 1533, her coronation lavishly staged as if to erase the memory of Catherine. The following September, she gave birth to a daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Though the king had hoped for a son, He celebrated publicly, convinced that more sons would follow. But for Henry Fitzroy, the birth of Elizabeth was a silent catastrophe. The new Queen's ascendancy pushed him to the margins. His titles and estates remained, yet his symbolic value to the crown diminished overnight. He was no longer the king's hidden solution to the problem of succession. He had become a relic of the past, a reminder of a mistake the court no longer wished to acknowledge. From her quiet home in the countryside, Bessie Blount watched these events unfold like distant thunder. She received fragments of news through letters, travellers, or servants who dared to whisper. She knew that Anne's rise had rewritten every rule of court life, that the same king who had once risked eternity for her own affection now risked the kingdom itself for another woman. Bessie understood the game better than most. She had lived through its early version, the gilded courtship, the secrecy, the whispers behind closed doors. She had once been the woman lifted up by royal favour and then discarded without ceremony. And now she saw the same wheel turning again. The difference was that Anne's ambition reached beyond survival. She sought a crown. For nearly 3 years, the new Queen's dominance seemed unshakable. Yet beneath the splendour of Whitehall and the golden canopies of Westminster, her foundation was already cracking. She failed to produce the long-awaited son, and her sharp tongue, so alluring in courtship, became a weapon that turned allies into enemies. By the spring of 1536, the king's passion had cooled, and the machinery of accusation began to move. That May, Anne Boleyn was charged with adultery, incest, and treason crimes, fabricated through coerced confessions and political manipulation. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and on the 19th day of that month, she was executed by sword within its walls. The speed of her downfall was terrifying. 1 week she had been Queen of England. The next, she was gone, her body buried in an unmarked grave at Street Peter ad Vincula. For Bessie, the news carried a haunting echo. She saw in Anne's fate a reflection of her own proof that in Tudor England, a woman's worth began and ended with her womb. Whether mistress or queen, survival depended on producing a male heir. Those who succeeded were briefly adored. Those who failed were erased or destroyed. After Anne's death, Jane Seymour became Henry's third wife. In the year 1537, she bore the long-awaited son, Prince Edward. The king was overjoyed, proclaiming the child as divine vindication of his choices. Yet 12 days after giving birth, Jane died of puerperal fever, the same fate Bessie herself had narrowly escaped. Henry ordered her buried with royal honours and declared her the only wife he had truly loved. Perhaps because she never lived long enough to disappoint him. Bessie could only grieve in silence. She had once endured the same agony of childbirth and lived. Yet that survival had brought her neither love nor honour. The irony was sharp. She had given Henry his first living son, and yet her name was forbidden even to be spoken. Jane, who delivered a legitimate heir, was immortalised as the perfect queen. Meanwhile, the tides of religion and politics swept England into chaos. Monasteries were dissolved, nobles seized land, and rebellion flickered across the northern counties. The king remarried again and again Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, each new union shifting the power of families and factions. In this shifting world, Henry Fitzroy's place grew increasingly fragile. Though once seen as a potential heir, his legitimacy could never be secured without parliamentary sanction. The king's infatuation with Anne Boleyn had already proved how swiftly loyalties could turn, and the birth of Edward pushed Fitzroy further toward obscurity. Bessie, still living under the title of Lady Clinton, knew better than anyone what this meant. Her son's fortune was tied to a father's desire that changed with the weather. At one moment he was celebrated as the proof of divine favour. At another, he was merely the king's reminder of youthful sin. At night, in the dim glow of her chamber, she must have thought of the women who had come and gone. Catherine, Anne, Jane, each elevated, each undone. She understood that the royal court was not a stage for romance, but a battlefield disguised in silk. In that cruel economy, even queens were expendable. Her own life had long been reduced to whispers. The palace no longer spoke her name. The history of the realm moved on without her. Yet, as she listened to the wind sweeping across the fields of Lincolnshire, she might have felt a strange kinship with all those women whose lives had been consumed by a single man's need for legacy. Bessie Blount had once been the first to bear him a son, and though history forgot her, She understood what every Tudor woman came to know, that in the kingdom of Henry VIII, love was never protection, and motherhood was never enough. In the year 1536, while Jane Seymour carried the long-awaited legitimate heir of the Tudor dynasty, Henry Fitzroy, then 17 years old, found himself adrift in a perilous political void. Once the king's pride, he had become an inconvenience. His existence, once celebrated as proof of the king's virility, now threatened to complicate the line of succession. The court, already tense from religious reform and recent executions, regarded him as a ghost of a former chapter 1 that needed quietly to disappear. Fitzroy's health had always been delicate. Official records claim that he suffered from consumption, what we now know as tuberculosis, a common and deadly disease in Tudor England. But the timing of his death, the 23rd day of July, 1536, raised quiet suspicion even among his contemporaries. His decline was sudden, his passing swift, and his burial almost secret. It was a year drenched in blood and transition. Queen Catherine of Aragon was dead in January. Anne Boleyn had been executed in May, and Jane Seymour, the king's new consort, was pregnant with what was believed to be a male heir. The court was eager to cleanse itself of scandal and doubt. In that feverish atmosphere, Fitzroy's death seemed both convenient and final, the removal of a potential rival before he could ever be used as one. There was no grand funeral, no royal procession. The young duke's body was sealed in lead and taken quietly to Thetford Priory in Norfolk. The ceremony was held in near secrecy, attended only by a handful of servants and minor clergy. The king did not appear, neither did his court. The burial was swift, almost furtive, as if the realm itself wished to erase the existence of the boy who had once embodied its future. Some whispered that poison had hastened his end. Others said that the king himself ordered silence to avoid public sympathy. But the truth was never recorded. What remains certain is that Bessie Blount, his mother, was not permitted to attend. In her manor far from London, she may have received the news through a brief letter, or perhaps through a servant too fearful to say the words aloud. There would have been no comfort, no condolences, no official acknowledgement. Her grief was meant to be private, unspoken, invisible. At night, the hallways of the Clinton estate must have felt unbearably empty. She had survived scandal, exile, childbirth, and years of obscurity, but nothing compared to the hollow ache of a mother forbidden to mourn. Every sound, the wind against the shutters, the creak of the wooden floor, the whisper of servants in the corridor became a reminder of the silence surrounding her loss. At dinner, conversation was cautious. Her husband, Edward Clinton, though sympathetic, likely dared not mention Fitzroy's name. Servants spoke in murmurs, lowering their voices when she entered the room. The only news she ever heard of her son came in fragmented rumours, a passing mention in court gossip, a fleeting word about how swiftly he had been laid to rest. She would not have been able to ask questions. To inquire too much about Fitzroy's death was to risk drawing the king's ire, or worse, to appear as if she suspected foul play. So she endured her sorrow in silence, wearing her mourning not as black cloth but as restraint. The court expected her to smile, to dine, to receive guests as though nothing had changed. For Bessie, grief became a kind of ritual. Each morning she walked the same garden paths, her fingers brushing the hedges as if counting the days backward to the moment her child was born. At dusk, when the house fell still, she might have whispered his name into the air only once, softly, like a secret prayer. The king moved on swiftly. The death of his illegitimate son was not marked by proclamation or monument. No coin bore Fitzroy's image. No chapel was built in his memory. His properties and titles were reclaimed by the crown without dispute. His young widow, Lady Mary Howard, though married to him in name, was denied inheritance. Her dowry was withheld. Her alliance to the powerful Howard family was quietly dissolved through another political arrangement. Fitzroy's short life, and by extension, Bessie's greatest sacrifice, was erased from official record almost overnight. In a matter of weeks, the boy who had once been hailed as the hope of the Tudor line had become a footnote, buried not only beneath stone but beneath policy. To the courtiers, he was a chapter best forgotten, the illegitimate experiment of a restless king who had finally secured his lawful son through Jane Seymour. To his mother, though, he remained the pulse of her existence. Even after his death, She must have felt his presence in everything, in the silence of the evening bells, in the laughter of her younger children, in the hollow of her hands when she reached instinctively for what was no longer there. As the months passed, the court rejoiced again. In October of 1537, Queen Jane gave birth to Prince Edward, the legitimate heir. 12 days later, she died of infection, and Henry once more wrapped tragedy in the cloth of triumph. The king commanded the nation to mourn her as the only true wife he had ever loved. For Bessie, those words must have pierced deeply. She had risked her life to bear his first son, a son whose existence had once proven Henry's manhood, yet now both were discarded, unspoken, unnamed. She could not weep publicly. She could not even pray for him in the parish chapel without attracting attention. In the years that followed, her name faded from the rolls of courtly correspondence. She ceased to appear at gatherings, withdrew from the games and music she had once mastered. The court, as it always did, forgot. But somewhere in Lincolnshire, perhaps near a window overlooking the fields, a woman who had once been beloved of a king sat alone, tracing in her memory the small face of the boy she could never bury. Thus ended the story of Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, born in royal splendor, buried in silence, remembered only by the woman who had given him life. And with his death, Bessie Blount's last link to the Tudor court was severed forever, leaving her not disgraced, not exiled, merely erased. After losing her firstborn son, Bessie Blount remained the devoted wife of Edward Clinton, living in the wide, fertile lands of Lincolnshire. Outwardly, her life seemed to have settled into prosperity. As Lady Clinton, she managed estates, oversaw farms, and dealt with local tenants who came to petition her for guidance. She had fields of barley and rye to inspect, barns to fill, taxes to review, and servants to discipline. On market days, she would ride through the villages, her carriage followed by attendants, her face calm and unreadable. She made decisions with quiet authority when to hire new labourers, how to handle the damage from flooding after the autumn rains, when to purchase timber for bridge repairs. She supervised the brewing of ale, the storing of grain, and the distribution of rations to the poor in hard winters. To those around her, she was a model of grace and efficiency, a noblewoman who had learned the art of endurance. But at night, when the house fell silent and the wind from the fens crept through the shutters, her composure dissolved. Alone in her chamber, surrounded by the muted flicker of candlelight, she would remember Henry Fitzroy, the child who had nearly cost her life, the son she had never been allowed to raise. Did he ever think of her, she must have wondered? Did he remember the mother banished to the countryside, or was she now just a faint rumour whispered by old servants? In her mind, she reconstructed his days, the Latin lessons, the fencing practice, the long tables filled with tutors and courtiers. She imagined his voice, his laughter, the way he might have carried himself all built from memory and longing. And then came the guilt. She blamed herself for her silence, for her obedience, for not fighting harder when they took him away. Was it weakness, or simply survival? Under Tudor law, even grief could be treasonous. A mother who spoke too much risked her family's ruin, and so she had stayed silent, watching from a distance as her son grew into a prince and then vanished from history. Still, Bessie did not retreat entirely from the world. Her sense of duty, perhaps her way of coping, found purpose in service. She became a benefactor to the community, commissioning repairs for the village church, donating silver for the altar, helping to rebuild a small bridge over the river after a spring flood. She sponsored harvest festivals and paid the dowries of poor girls in the parish. To the villagers, Lady Clinton was generous and wise, a woman of quiet kindness who carried herself with a serenity that masked her sorrow. But beneath that polished surface, the grief never eased. When the news of Fitzroy's death reached her long after it had happened, it struck like a second death of the same child. It came not through royal messenger or official seal, but in the hushed voice of a servant who had heard it mentioned by a traveller. Her son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, had died on the 23rd of July, 1536, barely 17 years old. Bessie froze. The words hung in the air like cold smoke. Her mind searched for meaning: illness, accident, poison, fate, but none mattered. The child she had given everything for, the only living proof of her place in history, was gone. and she had not even been allowed to see his grave. For hours, perhaps days, she spoke to no one. She continued her duties by habit-signing documents, giving instructions, walking through the orchards, but her eyes were far away. She realized with brutal clarity that she had lost her son twice. First when the court took him from her arms, and again when death took him from the world. Yet she did not collapse. Like so many women of her time, she endured. She folded her sorrow into routine, transforming pain into discipline. By the early 1540s, Edward Clinton was rising swiftly in rank. Under King Edward VI, he became Lord High Admiral of England, commanding fleets, negotiating treaties, representing the crown abroad. Bessie accompanied him to formal banquets and receptions, her presence dignified and controlled. She conversed in Latin, a language she had learned decades earlier at court, impressing ambassadors and envoys with her calm intellect. But behind the polite exchanges and measured smiles, her gaze often drifted into distance 1,000 miles away in thought. She spoke with courtesy, listened attentively, yet part of her was always elsewhere, among the fields of Shropshire, where she had once been a girl, or perhaps in the echo of a long silenced cradle. Even as she served beside her husband in affairs of governance, she lived within a private world of absence. To lose a child under the Tudors was to lose both blood and identity. To lose a royal child was to be erased from memory. But Bessie resisted erasure in the only way she could, by living well. In later years, though her health began to fade, she continued her quiet routines. She read psalms at dawn, inspected the servants, oversaw the accounts. At times, she would pause by the window, watching the mist rise over the fields, her hands clasped loosely before her, as though holding something invisible. She never returned to court. Yet deep within, she longed for one last visit to London, not to reclaim status, but to stand again on the cobblestones of the palace grounds, to look upon the river where her youth had once glimmered. Perhaps she imagined she could whisper to the wind, "My son, you are still my son." Ho! But history did not grant such reconciliations. By the year 1540, her strength waned. Some said she died quietly in her sleep. Others believed her heart simply gave out after years of restrained sorrow. She was around 40 years old, neither young nor old, but weathered by silence. There was no grand monument, no royal epitaph. Her burial place remains uncertain, perhaps within the Clinton estates, perhaps in a small parish church. Her name faded from record soon after. Yet her legacy lingered, not in stone or script, but in the invisible endurance of a mother's love, the kind history cannot erase. Long after her passing, the world remembered the king, the queens, the wars, the churches, but not the woman who had given birth to his first living son. Still, in the quiet hours before dawn, if one were to walk the misty fields of Lincolnshire, they might imagine her there, standing by the river, her face turned toward the horizon, whispering to a child she never stopped loving. The death of Bessie Blount, around the year 1540, closed the final page of a life defined by injustice and quiet endurance. She left the world as she had lived in it, silently, without monument or fanfare. No stone bears her name, no epitaph records her virtues. Her passing was not marked by procession or prayer, only by the fading echo of a life that history had already begun to forget. In the centuries that followed, her name survived only as a brief line in the chronicles of Henry VIII. One of the king's mistresses who bore him a son. That is all a footnote, a fragment, a whisper between the margins of men's triumphs. Yet beneath that small remark lay the immense weight of a woman's existence. Her youth, her choices not chosen, her motherhood denied. Bessie's story mirrors the fate of countless Tudor women whose names were erased once they ceased to serve a royal or political purpose. For every queen remembered Catherine, Anne, Jane, there were dozens of forgotten figures like her, women who danced in candlelight for a crown that never truly saw them, who gave birth in agony for a legacy they were forbidden to touch. She had once embodied the fragile balance between favour and ruin. For a moment she was the king's proof of virility, the mother of a living son, the quiet triumph of the Tudor bloodline. But when that moment passed, she was set aside her body, having fulfilled its purpose, her voice no longer needed. What remained was a title without joy, a lady of good breeding, respectable but invisible, a symbol of survival rather than of power. In truth, Bessie Blount's life was a mirror held up to the world of the 16th century, reflecting its cold arithmetic. A woman's worth measured not by her intellect, her kindness, or her courage, but by the child she delivered, and whether that child was male. In that merciless hierarchy, even the miracle of life was reduced to calculation. For a woman of her time, motherhood was not sanctuary, but sentence. The womb that created heirs was exalted. The same womb, once emptied, was forgotten. The heart that nurtured was expected to endure in silence, never to question, never to grieve aloud. And so, Bessie lived and died within that silence. She had navigated a system designed to consume women and discard them whole. Her beauty had opened the gilded door of the court. Her fertility had momentarily elevated her family's name, and her obedience had kept her alive when others perished. Yet none of these granted her freedom. When we trace the thread of her story, we find not only personal tragedy, but the structure of an entire world. A world in which a woman's body was a political instrument, her emotions treated as liabilities, her memory preserved only when it served the tale of a man. The Tudor court was a theatre of power, where women were both spectacle and sacrifice. Queens were crowned and executed in the same hall. Mistresses were celebrated in song and forgotten in dust. The cycle repeated, generation after generation, each woman learning too late that devotion was not protection. Bessie's quiet disappearance became part of that pattern. No scandal marked her end. No rebellion bore her name. She faded as the world shifted from her time to another, from Henry VIII's iron reign to Edward VI's brief promise. Yet her absence spoke louder than her presence ever had. She represents not merely a single lost woman, but the countless whose histories were unwritten, those whose children were taken, whose love was forbidden, whose intelligence was dismissed. Through her we glimpse the scaffolding of a society that feared female power even as it depended upon it. 500 years later, her story still resonates not as gossip from an old court, but as a mirror for the present. The notion that a woman's value begins and ends with her reproductive success has echoed through the ages. It lingers subtly in cultures and systems that still measure women by marriage, motherhood, or obedience. To remember Bessie Blount is therefore an act of defiance. It is to reclaim the voice of one who was told to be silent. It is to say that her suffering mattered, that her endurance was not weakness, but quiet strength. Her life reminds us that the right to bear children must never erase the right to be heard, that motherhood, sacred though it is, must not be the sole measure of worth. That dignity cannot depend on lineage or gender. If history forgot her, then telling her story anew becomes an act of restoration, a small resurrection for all those erased by time. When we speak of Bessie Blount, we do not merely revisit the shadows of the Tudor court. We confront the echo that still follows women through centuries. Your value lies in what you give, not in who you are. But Bessie's life, stripped bare of its illusions, tells us otherwise. Her worth was not in the crown she never wore, nor in the son she was forced to lose. It was in her endurance, the quiet refusal to break beneath a system built to crush her. Perhaps that is why her story endures at all. Not as legend, but as a lesson. In the silence of her unnamed grave, she stands for every woman who was told to disappear, and for every voice that refused to die. Beyond the private tragedy of Bessie Blount, the entire history of the Tudor dynasty is a graveyard of women's suffering. Around Henry VIII, 6 queens rose and fell in rhythm with his desires, each a symbol of devotion, each a casualty of his need for a son. Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who came to England as a bride of diplomacy, endured 6 pregnancies. Each one was a trial of blood and prayer. She lost infant after infant, sometimes within hours of birth, until only Princess Mary survived. After more than 2 decades of service as wife and queen, she was cast aside, banished to a cold castle, denied contact with her daughter, left to die alone in the year 1536. Then came Anne Boleyn, the dazzling courtier who dared to defy the order of the church and rewrite her fate. For a brief moment she ruled beside the king, crowned with triumph and danger. But her power was a fragile flame. Within 3 years, she was accused of adultery, condemned, and executed, her neck severed by a French sword in the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536. Her brilliance, once irresistible, became her sentence. Jane Seymour followed, quiet, pale, submissive, everything her predecessor was not. She bore the king a legitimate son, Prince Edward, in the year 1537. But 12 days later, she died of puerperal fever, her body consumed by infection. Henry, who had outlived love many times, proclaimed her his only true wife, perhaps because she died before he could tire of her. Anne of Cleves, the fourth queen, was spared the sword only because she obeyed swiftly. Married to Henry in a political alliance with the German states, she failed to please him physically. Within 6 months he divorced her, granting her the title of the king's beloved sister. She accepted quietly, withdrew from the court, and lived in comfort, the rare Tudor woman who survived by surrender. Catherine Howard, barely a woman, perhaps 17 when she became queen, was not so fortunate. Accused of adultery and treason, she was executed in February of 1542. Her final words, trembling on the scaffold, were said to be, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Thomas Culpeper." She had lived too briefly to understand that the court devoured youth faster than it rewarded it. And lastly, Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, who managed to survive the king himself. She soothed his temper, flattered his ego, and outlived him by barely a year. In 1548, she too died of childbirth fever, after giving birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour. Even survival was temporary. In a world that equated a woman's life with her womb, these 6 women, each draped in jewels, each wrapped in tragedy, form the outer circle of Henry's reign, the visible symbols of a king's private obsession. Yet Bessie Blount, who was never queen, stands beside them in spirit. She bore the first of his living sons, and for that, she too was consumed and forgotten. All 7, the queens and the mistress alike, reveal the same brutal truth, that in the Tudor court, the greatest crown a woman could wear was maternity, and the greatest crime was failure. Whether royal or minor gentry, their destinies were written not by their hearts or minds, but by their bodies. The contrast is haunting. In paintings, Tudor queens gleam with pearls, their faces serene beneath the weight of silk and brocade. But behind those portraits lies the same quiet despair, the same knowledge that one miscarriage, one rumour, one whisper could destroy everything. The court celebrated beauty and obedience while punishing thought and emotion. Women were draped in velvet and silence. Their worth was measured in heirs, their virtue in compliance. Those who yielded were pitied, those who resisted were executed, and those who were neither like Bessie simply disappeared into the countryside, erased by neglect. This was the paradox of Tudor splendor. The culture glittered with gold while rotting underneath with fear. Every smile at court concealed calculation. Every dance masked negotiation. The very elegance of that world, its polished manners, its Latin orations, its religious rituals, was built upon the suffering of women whose voices were never meant to be heard. For all its grandeur, it was a kingdom of men, and the women were its currency. Power passed through them, but never to them. They were vessels of inheritance, not individuals of authority. Their love was politicized, their bodies national property, their fates dependent on the fragile whims of one man. Even now, centuries later, the echo remains. The belief that a woman's value lies in her ability to bear, to serve, to sustain. It lingers in many corners of the modern world. The language has softened, but the expectation endures. In every society that still praises daughters for marrying well, or judges women by motherhood, the ghost of Tudor England lives on. Bessie Blount's life becomes more than a story. It becomes a mirror. She reminds us that equality cannot exist where autonomy is denied. That motherhood should be a choice, not a measure. That dignity cannot be granted by another's desire. When we tell her story today, we do not do so to reopen old wounds, but to remember what silence costs. She was born in an age when the female body was both weapon and wound, and though she lived quietly, her endurance speaks across centuries. Her life, and the lives of the 6 queens, form a single requiem. For every woman whose worth was weighed against a son, for every voice buried under the crowns of men. In the soft dusk of history, their faces fade, but their suffering remains a warning, a whisper. Remember us, and do not let it happen again. The story of Bessie Blount, reaches beyond the Tudor court and opens a timeless wound, the bond between mother and child, and the cruelty of losing that bond by force. The boy she bore, Henry Fitzroy, son of a king, should have been hers to hold, to nurse, to raise into manhood. Yet from the very moment he drew breath, he was taken from her arms, claimed not as her child but as the property of the crown. It was the old policy of dynastic survival. Every child born of royal blood belonged first to the kingdom, not to the woman who birthed him. Legitimacy could be created by decree. Affection, by contrast, was irrelevant. The mother's love was invisible in the eyes of law and power. Bessie raised other children, later those born of her two marriages, first to Gilbert Tale boys, and then to Edward Clinton. But none could fill the silence left by the first. That missing son, the one she could not hold, haunted every corner of her life. Even as she smiled at her younger children, teaching them to sew, to read, to recite prayers, her heart wandered toward the boy who had once been hers in secret, and was now hers only in memory. Through her loss, we see a broader truth about Tudor England and, perhaps, about all societies that measure women by their usefulness to lineage. The monarchy claimed to honour motherhood, but in practice it dismantled it. A mother who gave birth to a royal son was exalted in name and erased in life. Her child became a political emblem, and she, the vessel that delivered him, was expected to vanish back into the countryside. Bessie's silence was not resignation. It was survival. She could neither question the king's decision nor express her grief. To protest the separation was to challenge authority, and to challenge authority was to invite ruin. So she learned to endure, to live with the ache of an absent child while maintaining the poise of a noblewoman. Each passing year added new layers to her restraint. She attended mass, signed household accounts, smiled politely at visitors, and played her role as Lady Clinton with unerring grace. But every small act of composure was built upon a foundation of sorrow. The right to motherhood, to simply be a mother, had been taken from her, and there was no recourse, no language, no law to restore it. The pain of separation was its own form of imprisonment. Bessie's suffering did not come from exile or public humiliation, but from the quiet and permanent deprivation of love. The royal court never considered it cruelty. To them, it was protocol. But to the woman who had bled and nearly died to bring life into the world, it was a sentence of emotional death. This tension between visible privilege and invisible loss defines her story. To outsiders, she seemed fortunate, a noblewoman with land, servants, and status. Yet beneath the silks and titles, she carried a grief that outlived her youth. It was the hidden cost of royal favour, the unspoken price of bearing a king's child. By the end of her life, that grief had transformed into weariness. Those who knew her in later years described her as quiet and melancholic, though such words barely touched the truth. She had endured too much. The suffocating etiquette of court, the exile of provincial life, the constant balancing act between dignity and despair. And when her son died in 1536, the last fragile thread of meaning in her life was cut. She had once looked to the night sky, to the same cold stars that hung over Shropshire and London alike, and whispered to them in loneliness. Perhaps, in those final years, she did the same, her gaze drifting upward as if searching for the child she could never reach. When death came for her, around the year 1540, it felt less like tragedy than release. She was tired. Tired of silence, tired of endurance, tired of remembering. Her life ended not with scandal or spectacle, but with the quiet dignity she had carried all along. She was buried without monument, without inscription, as though the world had decided once more to keep her hidden. But even in anonymity, her story remained a faint echo beneath the louder tales of kings and wars. And that story, stripped of titles and pageantry, reveals something both intimate and universal. Bessie's struggle was not merely about a single lost child, but about the right of every woman to love, to grieve, to belong to her own life. Her suffering exposed how deeply a system can wound when it values inheritance above humanity. When we speak of her now, across 5 centuries, we touch that same wound that has never fully healed. The separation of mothers from their children by war, by poverty, by law, by expectation, still lingers in many forms. The Tudor dynasty may be gone, but the logic of control that shaped it survives in subtler ways. In the lingering idea that motherhood is duty, not desire, that obedience is virtue, that a woman's worth must be proven through sacrifice. Bessie's story reminds us that motherhood is not simply biological, it is emotional, moral, spiritual, a bond that cannot be legislated or erased by decree. To be denied that bond is to lose a part of the soul itself. As her life faded into history, she became a symbol not of scandal but of resilience. Her tragedy mirrors those of countless others whose voices never entered the record. Women who bore life into a world that refused to see them as living beings. When we look back at her now, we do more than remember the mistress of a king. We remember the mother who was not allowed to be one, and in doing so, we acknowledge every woman silenced by the laws of power, every mother separated from her child, every heart that learned to love in silence. Bessie Blount's life, though forgotten by monuments, endures in the quiet truth she left behind, that love unacknowledged is still love, and that even in erasure, a mother's voice can echo across centuries. And now, as the echoes of the Tudor court begin to fade, let us slow down together. The fire has dimmed, the music has quieted, and the last fragments of Bessie's story drift like dust in the candlelight. She came into this world quietly and left it the same way. No monuments, no hymns, only the trace of a mother's love scattered through time. And yet, in her silence, there is something powerful, something that lingers long after the kings and crowns are gone. Perhaps the true meaning of her life was never about scandal or royalty. It was about what it means to love in a world that does not let you love freely, to endure loss without bitterness, to remain gentle, even after being forgotten. When we remember Bessie Blount, we remember every woman who was told that her worth depended on what she could give to others, a child, a service, a legacy, and who quietly proved that her soul was far greater than any title could contain. She reminds us that compassion is strength, and that even those erased by history leave behind ripples that never truly disappear. So if tonight's story has left you with a heaviness, let it settle softly. Let it remind you that behind every forgotten name lies a life as real, as fragile, and as beautiful as our own. History often remembers power, but it is tenderness that survives the centuries. Now, take a deep breath. Let your eyes grow heavy. Imagine the flicker of a candle slowly fading out, the air calm, the night vast. And somewhere far away, the whisper of a woman who once loved and lost beneath the same stars we see tonight. May her story remind you to be kind, to cherish what you hold, and to forgive what time has taken. Good night, my friends. Sleep gently, and if you wish to keep wandering with us through the forgotten corners of history, remember to like, subscribe, and come back for the next story. There are so many more voices waiting to be heard, waiting to whisper to you in the dark.